They called Strasser's crew the cleanest cutters in the camp. On the daily timber sheet, their numbers were always high. Their saws came back wiped. Their axes returned aligned like a display. The guards liked it because it made the camp look efficient, and efficiency was the only kind of peace an overworked garrison trusted. The result was simple. Strasser's men were treated as a useful exception. The cost was that nobody asked what the exception was buying. Captain Chen Jun asked anyway, but quietly. He had been sent to a temporary prisoner of war camp tucked into the Bavarian foothills where late snow still ruled the nights. His orders were practical. Keep the prisoners alive, keep the work moving, keep the paperwork clean. The Geneva rules were posted in German and English, laminated against wet weather. The camp regulations were blunt. Prisoners could not discipline other prisoners. The result was a clean doctrine. The cost was that doctrine didn't explain what happened when prisoners punished each other without leaving marks. Chen learned to measure more than output. At the timberline, most work details sounded like men, arguments, jokes, the occasional shouted insult. Strasser's details sounded like machinery. Boots in rhythm, saw teeth singing at the same pace, no wasted words. The result was a steady work rate. The cost was the silence that rode behind it, heavier than the mountain air. He noticed who avoided whom. In the mess line, men drifted away from Strasser's circle without being pushed. In the barracks, bodies angled to make space before Strasser arrived, as if his shadow carried rules nobody had written down. The result was order that did not need guards. The cost was that order came from fear, not consent. Strasser didn't look like a man who needed permission. His file called him a former Waffen SS officer and assault detachment leader. The phrasing was cold. The man was not. He was tall, controlled, and economical with motion. When he wanted someone to move, he didn't raise his voice. He shifted his gaze and someone moved. The result was authority that felt natural to the camp. The cost was that it bypassed Chen's authority without challenging it openly. Chen tried to find the seam where the hidden power met the visible one. He asked Weber, the camp translator, to stay close on rounds. Weber spoke careful German and kept his tone flat, as if language itself could be procedural. The result was fewer misunderstandings. The cost was that Weber became a conduit that both sides would try to control. The first clear signal came from a small mistake. One evening at the tool shed, a young prisoner stepped out of line carrying a saw. His hands were numb and his grip slipped. The saw fell into packed snow with a soft clink. Guards smirked. A dropped tool was nothing. The result should have been embarrassment and a quick correction. The cost arrived instead in the young man's face. He went pale, froze in place, and looked past the guards towards Strasser's men, as if waiting for a sentence. His name was Kellner. Kellner's mouth opened, but no sound came. He half-crouched to retrieve the saw, then stopped again, trapped between movements like a man deciding which motion would hurt less. One of Strasser's followers stepped forward, took the saw without a word, wiped it with a rag that seemed pre-positioned, and put it away with ceremonial precision. The line resumed as if nothing happened. The result was discipline. The cost was Kellner's terror, visible and unexplained. On the walk back, Chen asked Weber what Kellner had whispered. Weber hesitated, then answered in English to keep it private. He said he'll die. The result was a sentence that didn't belong to a dropped saw. The cost was that Chen could no longer tell himself this was only culture and pride. Chen went to the infirmary log. Mountain camps produce injuries. That was expected. What bothered Chen was the pattern. Severe blisters in men assigned light work. Bruises described as slips that matched no slip. Frostbite in men who claimed they forgot gloves. Kellner's name appeared more than once. Each entry vague, each tone ashamed. The result was a suspicion strong enough to act on. The cost was that suspicion wasn't evidence, and Chen could not arrest a pattern. Meanwhile, a rumor began spreading with the ease of smoke. A guard sergeant mentioned that prisoners were asking whether Americans planned to shoot all SS men after the war. The sergeant laughed, but the prisoners didn't. The result was a new axis of fear. Not just Strasser, but the future. The cost was that Strasser could bind men together by pointing them at an imaginary firing squad. Chen refused to give that rumor oxygen, but he couldn't ignore its effect. He watched men accept Strasser's order because it felt like protection. He watched others endure humiliation because it felt safer than being seen as disloyal by Germans and suspicious by Americans at the same time. The result was a camp that kept moving. The cost was a growing internal regime that could survive any American instruction by calling it temporary. Chen waited for something that would force the hidden regime to touch the ground. It came with weather. In late March, a storm rolled down the slopes with sideways snow and a wind that turned floodlights into swinging pendulums. Visibility collapsed. Guards tried to stay indoors. Even dogs hunkered down. The result was a night when anything could happen unseen. The cost was that Chen knew unseen harm was exactly what he needed to prevent. He took Weber and made rounds himself. Near the maintenance area, Chen heard a sound that didn't match the storm. Slow metal on metal, steady and deliberate. He followed it to a floodlight and found Kellner kneeling in the snow, bare hands on steel, scraping ice from tools one by one. Two men stood nearby under pretense of smoking, watching him like wardens. The result was proof that discipline was being enforced outside American oversight. The cost was the immediate risk. Kellner's hands were already turning waxy white. Chen shouted in German and hauled Kellner up by the collar. Kellner's lips were blue. His eyes were distant. When Chen looked at Kellner's fingers, he felt the cold anger of a man watching paperwork become disability. The result was a forced emergency. The cost was that emergency would demand a public response, and public responses create backlash. Weber ran for the doctor while Chen marched Kellner to the infirmary. The doctor swore, started warming packs, and wrote while he treated: severe frostbite, risk of tissue loss. The result was a medical record that could not be argued away. The cost was that the record still did not name who had ordered the punishment, and the camp would fill that blank with stories. Chen filled the campyard with floodlight and siren. Prisoners stumbled out into snow, coats pulled tight, forming rows by habit. Strasser stood near the front, face calm, his circle clustered with the same smooth efficiency as at the timberline. The result was the camp's unofficial leadership displayed in formation. The cost was that any misstep now would be witnessed by everyone. Chen stepped onto the announcement platform and read the regulations. He did not accuse anyone. He read the line forbidding prisoner-on-prisoner punishment. He read the line placing discipline under American authority. Each sentence landed like a tool strike, simple, cold, undeniable. The result was that Chen reclaimed the language of legitimacy. The cost was that legitimacy, spoken aloud, can sound like a threat to men who live on rumors. Then Chen added one extra clause because he could feel the future pressing on their throats. "No one here will be shot for membership," he said in German. "There will be process, there will be records, there will law." The result was a direct counter to Strasser's rumor weapon. The cost was that Strasser could now frame process as a trap designed to make men inform on each other. The prisoners did not cheer. They filed back to barracks with the same silence that had bothered Chen from the start, but now it felt sharpened, as if the camp were holding its breath. The result was a public line drawn. The cost was the camp's emotional temperature dropping further, fear turning from open submission into hidden calculation. In the days that followed, Strasser's punishment didn't vanish. It changed shape. No one dragged Kellner into the snow again. Instead, Kellner stopped receiving small necessities, a place by the stove, a spare rag, a warning about a loose board. Men turned their faces away from him as he passed. The result was social isolation that left no bruises. The cost was that Chen had no direct handle to grab. He could not punish looking away. Weber reported new whispers. Some prisoners believed Chen's announcement was a trick to identify SS men. Others believed America wanted Germans to denounce each other so that the camp could be cleansed. The result was a poisonous ambiguity that kept mouths shut. The cost was that any prisoner who approached Chen risked becoming an example in Strasser's eyes. One night, Chen heard Strasser's voice in a barracks again. It was low, precise, the cadence of instruction. Honor, betrayal, weakness. Dozens of men listened in the dark and breathed quietly together, afraid to interrupt. The result was confirmation that Strasser's authority now lived in words, not fists. The cost was that words spread faster than evidence. Chen returned to headquarters and wrote 2 orders that looked administrative. First, increased night patrols with time-stamped checkpoints. Second, Morrison would begin English listening exercises immediately. The result was a plan to collect facts while disrupting the story Strasser was building. The cost was that facts, if mishandled, could ignite the camp as easily as lies. Before dawn, Chen checked the infirmary once more. Kellner's fingers might be saved, the doctor said, but they would never be normal. Kellner stared at the ceiling and said nothing. The result was that Chen could claim a medical success. The cost was that the camp had learned a new lesson. Punishment could happen even after American rules were read aloud. At the timberline, Strasser's saws still sang in perfect rhythm. Chen listened and heard 2 sounds at once, metal on wood and a quieter rhythm beneath it, the steady beat of a story in which Americans were blind and Strasser was still in charge. The result was clarity about what he was really fighting. The cost was that his next move would have to look like routine, or the camp's first blood would arrive disguised as an accident. Morrison began the listening exercise with a purpose that sounded harmless. He told the prisoners the army wanted their English improved so they could read repatriation notices when the time came. It was practical and boring, which made it believable. The result was a classroom that looked like policy. The cost was that content would hit harder because nobody had been warned to brace. The classroom was a converted storage room with a weak stove. Men sat hunched on benches. Weber stood ready to translate. Chen watched from the back as if reviewing forms because he needed to see reactions without making himself the center. The result was a controlled environment for truth. The cost was that truth in a camp full of fear behaves like a spark. Morrison tuned the radio until an English broadcast cut through the static. It started with troop movements and town names, war as geography. Then the announcer's tone shifted, and references appeared to camps that were not prisoner camps: starvation, bodies, graves. Weber translated plainly, with no added emotion. The result was a fact pattern entering the prisoners' minds. The cost was immediate. Pens stopped, throats tightened, eyes widened. Koch's pencil snapped. The small crack sounded huge in the room. Koch stared at the broken pencil as if it were proof that something could not be put back. The result was a visible fracture in denial. The cost was that visible fractures attract pressure. After class, prisoners didn't argue loudly, they argued in corners. Weber reported that men were asking whether the broadcast was propaganda, whether it could be a lie designed to break them. Others asked, more quietly, what process would mean for them after surrender. The result was a hunger to know mixed with terror of knowing. The cost was that Strasser could treat questions as treason. By dusk, that treatment began. A hard-faced older prisoner intercepted Koch near the mess line and spoke in a low voice. Koch flinched and backed away. Weber translated later, defeatist, weak, will be dealt with. The result was a new loyalty test in the open. The cost was that Chen's earlier promise of law now sounded to some men like bait. The next morning, a forged paper surfaced. A guard found it crumpled near the latrine trench and brought it to headquarters as if it were entertainment. The German handwriting was neat and official. It claimed to be a translation of an American directive. After surrender, all SS prisoners would be separated for special handling and cooperation would be rewarded. No signature, no stamp. It did not need them. The result was a rumor given the shape of a document. The cost was that any denial by Chen could be framed as further deception. Chen saw the trap in both directions. If he called an assembly to denounce it, Strasser could say the Americans were panicking because the paper was true. If he ignored it, the camp would assume silence meant confirmation. The result was a forced choice where either move could feed Strasser's story. The cost was that Chen needed a third path, one that changed conditions without arguing about narrative. He chose logistics. Chen split Strasser's inner circle across work details under the cover of efficiency, kitchen duty, fence repair under guard oversight, road clearing where noise swallowed whispers. He posted schedules earlier and changed posting times without notice. The result was disruption of the informal chain of command. The cost was that disruption makes men improvise, and improvisation is where violence often leaks. 3 days later, a slip happened. A prisoner on road detail fell and hit his head on a beam. He insisted it was an accident. The doctor stitched the gash, then found a bruise on the shoulder shaped like a boot sole. The result was a medical detail that contradicted the story. The cost was that Chen still did not have a witness willing to say who had used the boot. Chen did not arrest anyone for the bruise. He filed it. He watched patterns. He listened. At night, Chen walked past the barracks where he'd heard Strasser speak before and listened again. The same low cadence, the same words that turned fear into duty. Chen knocked, then entered without waiting, backed by regulations. Strasser stood near the stove, offended rather than surprised. The result was a reminder that the Americans could appear anywhere. The cost was that Chen's presence could also serve Strasser's narrative of harassment. Chen kept it procedural. He spoke to the room, not to Strasser, and repeated the rule. No internal trials, no threats. Complaints go through American channels. Then he gave an order that sounded trivial. Work details will be posted 1 hour earlier from now on. The result was a schedule shift that forced Strasser's watchers to scramble. The cost was that scrambling might produce a reaction Chen could not predict. It produced visibility. Strasser's men began asking questions they used to answer. They moved more often between barracks, trying to restitch control. Chen saw them because they were no longer smooth. The result was a loosening of Strasser's certainty. The cost was that loosening pushed Strasser toward a more dramatic act to restore fear. Koch approached Morrison in broken English. "I listen radio," he said. "I want more." Morrison didn't answer with speeches. He wrote 2 English words on scrap paper: surrender, process. The result was a private channel of meaning. The cost was that private channels invite punishment if discovered. That evening, Weber brought a man to Chen's office. The man's hands shook. He kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to open. He whispered in German. Weber translated. "There would be a fire," the man said. "Tonight, the wood pile. It would look like an accident. Someone who spoke to Americans would be blamed." The result was a concrete plan that explained the camp's rising pressure. The cost was that the informant's life was now hanging by a thread. Chen asked why the man came. The man didn't offer ideology or conscience. He said simply, "I don't want to be the next example." The result was a motive born of fear, not virtue. The cost was that fear-driven informants can break under pressure, and Chen had to protect him without making him visible. Chen moved without spectacle. He redeployed guards to the woodpile and tool shed, ordered lantern checks, and required time-stamped patrol entries at fixed points. He placed the informant in the infirmary under medical observation. He paused the radio exercises for 2 nights to remove one trigger Strasser could exploit in the dark. The result was a tightened perimeter and a recordable procedure. The cost was that tightening could be interpreted as confirmation that something was wrong, increasing panic. Near midnight, 2 shapes bent near the woodpile. Guards stepped out of shadow. The shapes froze. The guards found a can of fuel. The result was prevention of the fire without a public confrontation. The cost was that the discovery, once whispered through the camp, would push Strasser into hunting an internal traitor. Chen turned the night's facts into a file. Fuel can, patrol log, informant statement, the forged directive, the boot-shaped bruise note, Kellner's frostbite record, small facts, each insufficient alone, together forming a shape the staff could not unsee. The result was that Chen gained backing to change camp procedure. The cost was that the camp itself would feel that backing as pressure. Chen posted a new notice in German and English. The camp would elect a living representative to handle daily issues through the American office: work grievances, food complaints, clothing requests, medical needs, anonymous ballot. No candidate list. He added one more line that sounded like mercy and functioned like a wedge. Those coerced into wrongdoing who cease now would not be punished retroactively. The result was a safe exit ramp for the silent majority. The cost was that Strasser would now attack the ramp itself. The night before the vote, intimidation tried to become visible. A charcoal scrawl appeared near the latrine. Traitors and a handful of names. Not official, just meant to be seen. Chen ordered it scrubbed immediately, not because it erased fear, but because it denied fear a permanent surface. The result was removal of the symbol. The cost was that the message had already reached the minds it targeted. A note slipped under the infirmary door. It promised that anyone who voted against true leadership would be remembered. No signature, no method. The result was a threat designed to make imagination do the work. The cost was that imagination spreads faster than any guard. Chen filed the note instead of reading it aloud. He added it to the folder of small facts. Then he walked into the barracks with Weber and 2 guards and spoke about gloves and medical access. Logistics, not ideology. Anyone blocking supplies or care would violate camp rules. The result was a warning that social punishment would not control necessities. The cost was that Strasser's followers would now look for a different leverage point. The vote began at 8. Chen split prisoners into small groups with assigned time so crowds couldn't form. He placed ballot boxes in 3 locations: mess hall, infirmary corridor, tool shed, office. Each box was sealed with wax and stamped with time. Guards stood nearby, but outside the voting line, rotated hourly. Weber issued blank slips and pencils and recorded procedure, not names. The result was a process built to resist visibility. The cost was that some men still hesitated, and hesitation was what intimidation fed on. Some prisoners turned away at the door. They couldn't force their hands to write. Chen did not chase them. He needed a legitimate process, not forced participation. The result was reduced immediate conflict. The cost was lost votes that could later be claimed as support for Strasser. Koch entered anyway. His hand shook. He wrote, folded the slip, and dropped it into the sealed box. Nothing happened. No blow landed. No immediate consequence arrived. The result was a tiny proof that fear could be survived. The cost was that the real consequence, if it came, would come later, and everyone knew it. By late afternoon, the boxes were carried to headquarters. Weber and a lieutenant witnessed the seals broken. Morrison sat in the corner, silent. Chen refused to count alone. He wanted the outcome to be procedure, not a personal declaration. The result was a tally with institutional weight. The cost was that if the tally went wrong, Chen would own a disaster with witnesses. The slips sorted into piles. At first, the names scattered, then one pile grew steadily. Koch, over and over, in shaky pencil and neat script. When they reached the end, Chen looked for the pile he expected to exist, even if small. There wasn't one. Strasser received 0 votes. The result was not just defeat, it was abandonment. The cost was that abandonment can break a man into something unpredictable. Chen announced the result at dusk roll call. He spoke in German. The camp's living representative is Koch. A murmur moved through the rows. Not celebration, more like a room exhaling. Chen added the amnesty clause again. Those pressured into threats who ceased now would not be punished retroactively. New harm would be treated as violation of camp rules. The result was a legal boundary that encouraged cutting ties with Strasser. The cost was moral strain. Victims heard no punishment, and some swallowed anger like poison. Strasser stood in the front row, expression fixed. He didn't rage. He didn't plead. He smiled thinly, as if contempt could rebuild what votes had removed. But Chen saw the crack. Strasser's eyes searched for followers and found men staring at the ground or staring straight ahead, refusing to meet his gaze. The result was loss of the audience Strasser needed. The cost was that a man without an audience may seek a stage with blood. For 2 weeks, the camp ran on a different kind of order. Koch met Chen twice a week, bringing requests about boots, soap, bandages, work schedules. Chen approved what he could and denied what he had to, keeping the process visible. The result was a practical routine that displaced Strasser's informal court. The cost was that routine did not erase fear overnight, it only starved it. Then the surrender document arrived. Not radiostatic, not rumor. Paper delivered by courier, signed and stamped, impossible to twist into propaganda. Chen ordered assembly. Prisoners filed into the yard slowly, faces unreadable as if any emotion might be punished by somebody. The result was a stage created by protocol. The cost was that stages invite performances. Weber read the German translation. Unconditional surrender. Silence fell so deep Chen could hear the wind in the wire. Then a sound cracked it. Laughter, high and wrong. Strasser was laughing. He shouted about betrayal, about weak leaders, about the Reich being stabbed in the back. He turned his panic into accusation, trying to pull the camp back into his story. The result was a final attempt to restore fear through spectacle. The cost was that spectacle can turn into violence in an instant. Strasser lunged toward the platform. Chen saw what Strasser wanted, a public clash with Americans, a bruised face to claim martyrdom, a renewed narrative of oppression. Chen did not move first. He held his posture and let the yard choose what it would show itself. The result was a pause where meaning could flip. The cost was that if the flip failed, Chen would face chaos. 2 former Wehrmacht prisoners grabbed Strasser and slammed him into the snow. They pinned his arms and held him down. Strasser thrashed and spat words that scattered into the cold. But no crowd surged to save him. No chant rose. Men watched with fatigue, disgust, and a few with pity. The result was the most damaging fact Strasser could face. His own people were restraining him. The cost was that Strasser's last control collapsed into raw desperation. Chen stepped down and approached. He spoke in German, quiet but audible to those closest. "This isn't my judgment," he said. "It isn't the Allies. It's history, and it's your own people." The result was a sentence designed to remove Strasser's last claim to martyrdom. The cost was that Chen now had to close the moment quickly before it could splinter into debate. The doctor injected a sedative. Strasser's body fought, then slackened. Guards lifted him and carried him away under protective custody. The result was a non-violent end to the spectacle. The cost was that Strasser's story did not die. It had to be buried under records. Chen finished reading the surrender notice. Procedure mattered. Ending mattered. When he dismissed the prisoners, they returned to barracks unevenly, no longer marching to Strasser's rhythm. The result was a camp that had stepped out of a private regime. The cost was the hollow that follows fear. Men didn't know what to fill it with. Chen filled it with files. He compiled the frostbite record, the boot-bruised injury note, the forged directive, the fuel can report, the patrol logs, and the statements, some anonymous, about threats and coerced punishments. He attached them to Strasser's file for war crime screening rather than ordinary repatriation. The result was a path that made Strasser's future procedural, not mythical. The cost was that procedure required witnesses, and witnesses needed protection long after the fences came down. In late May, as the snow retreated up the mountain, Chen stood outside headquarters with Morrison. They listened to the camp. Hammers, saws, voices rising and falling naturally. Morrison said softly, "We won a small battle." Chen watched prisoners carry planks in pairs, speaking without checking for permission, and answered, "We just didn't lose the one we couldn't afford to lose." The result was a quiet closure without triumph. The cost was the lingering knowledge that fear, once learned, never leaves completely. It just runs out of food. Above them, the mountains stayed indifferent. But inside the wire, The camp's silence had changed from enforced to chosen, and that difference, Chen knew, was the only kind of victory that would still matter when the paperwork outlived them all.